Nebraska Territory, May 1872. The baby's cry was the only sound in the stillness of the abandoned grain bin, sharp and thin like wind through broken boards. Merrick pulled his horse to a stop, boots hitting the dirt as he dismounted. He had been riding toward the old Ramsey farmstead for feed rumors, not expecting anything more than a few busted wagons and a rotting barn. But that cry wasn't a coyote. It was human. He crossed the yard fast, hand on the revolver at his side, but when he pushed open the warped grain bin door, he froze. Inside, huddled in the dim light, was a woman barefoot, her dress torn in places, arms wrapped around a small bundle. Her wide green eyes locked onto his, wild with fear. The baby in her arms whimpered again. "Do not come near," she said, voice low but steady. "I am not here to hurt you," Isaac said, raising both hands. Heard the crying and thought. He looked at the baby, then back at her. She could not have been more than 23. "Are you hurt?" She looked down, jaw tight. "No, you got a name." She hesitated, then said, "Faye Latham." Isaac nodded once. "I am Merrick. I have a horse. You do not belong in a bin, Miss Latham." "I had nowhere else," she said, holding her baby tighter. "We walked 2 days. I needed to hide. He is only 4 weeks old. His name is Gideon." Isaac stepped back, giving her room. "You need food, shelter. That baby needs milk." Faye's lip trembled. "We will manage." "I do not think you will," Isaac said quietly. "Come with me. Both of you." She blinked at him, uncertain, and for a moment he thought she might say no, but the way she looked down at the baby told him everything. She would walk through fire if it meant keeping that child safe. He held out his hand. "You can ride." "I will walk if you do not want me that close." She stood slowly, every movement careful. Her shawl slipped, showing a bruise on her collarbone, and she flinched, covering it again. Isaac said nothing, but his jaw clenched. He stepped back to let her pass. They rode in silence, Faye tucked behind him on the horse, holding her baby in one arm and gripping his coat with the other. She did not speak, and he did not press her. The wind was cold for May, biting through his shirt, but she never complained. By the time they reached his homestead, 2 rooms, a lean-to stable, and a well out back, her hands were trembling from exhaustion. He helped her down gently, careful not to touch her unless she asked. "Inside," he said. "There is a fire and a cot. I will get the goat's milk." Faye stepped into the small cabin like she was afraid it would vanish. She looked around, eyes catching on the quilt folded at the foot of the bed, the pan of cornbread sitting cold on the table, the rifle hung above the hearth. "It is just me here," Isaac said from the doorway. "No wife, no one coming." She met his eyes. "Why are you helping us?" He shrugged. "Because I would want someone to help if it were my sister, or my mother, or me." She hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." Isaac stepped out and returned with a tin cup of warm goat's milk. "It is not much, but it will help." She sat in the rocker by the fire and fed her baby, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. Isaac watched for a moment, then turned away to give her privacy. Later, when the baby slept, Faye curled on the cot and pulled the quilt around her shoulders. Isaac stoked the fire and sat across the room, elbow on his knee, watching the embers glow. She spoke without looking at him. "I was married. He died last winter. His brother came after, said I owed him. When I refused, he beat me, took everything. I ran." Isaac's hands tightened into fists. "He will not find you here." She turned her face toward him, eyes tired but steady. "I do not want pity." "You will not get it from me," he said. "Only a safe place for as long as you want." She nodded once. "Then I will stay." Isaac let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "Good." The baby stirred, and Faye rose to check him. Her touch was gentle, her voice soft while she whispered to him. Isaac watched her, something warm curling in his chest. She was strong. Not loud or proud, but solid in a way he could not name. She had walked miles barefoot with a newborn in her arms and still stood straight. The next morning, Faye helped with the wash, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. Isaac chopped wood, stealing glances at her when she smiled at the baby in the grass. Gideon kicked his feet and cooed, his little face pink in the sun. "He likes it here," she said, lifting him. Isaac smiled. "He has good taste." Faye looked at him then, really looked like she saw something new. "So do I." He felt the words land in his chest, quiet and sure. He did not answer right away, just tipped his hat back and returned to the woodpile, but his heart beat faster. That night, as the sun slipped behind the hills, she stood beside him on the porch, the baby asleep inside. "I do not know what happens now," she said. "You do not have to," Isaac said. "You are here, that is enough." She looked up at him, her face soft in the firelight. Maybe it could be more. He turned to her slowly. "You mean that?" She nodded. Isaac reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She did not pull away. "I never met anyone like you," he said. "Not ever." She smiled, and it lit her up from the inside. "We are not running anymore, Isaac." "No," he said. "You are home now." The ground had softened with last night's rain, and the scent of damp earth drifted through the open window where Faye stood peeling potatoes. Her sleeves were rolled again, but differently now, neater, more deliberate, like she'd begun to settle into her skin again. Isaac was out at the paddock, driving fence posts into the slope behind the stable, and Gideon lay sleeping in a basket beside the hearth, his tiny chest rising and falling steady as a clock. The rhythm of her knife slowed as she glanced outside. Isaac stood with his back to her, shirt clinging to his shoulders from the labor. She watched his movements, the way he drove each post firm into the soil, then stepped back to check the spacing, quiet and thorough. There was no waste in how he worked. No rush, either. Just the kind of patience a man had when he knew everything worth doing took time. "You going to stare holes through me, Miss Latham?" he called without turning. She smiled into her hand, caught off guard by the warmth that bloomed in her chest. "Just making sure you ain't planting fence posts crooked." "That's so." He turned then, grinning as he leaned on the post driver. "Well, maybe I'll let you check 'em one by one. Keep me honest." "I might," she said, wiping her hands on her apron and stepping outside. The sun had broken through the clouds at last, and the sky stretched wide and blue above the prairie. Her boots sank slightly in the wet grass as she crossed the yard. He handed her a rough-cut yardstick. "Go on, then. Measure me." She took it, pretending to squint at the line of posts. "First one's leaning." "Is that right?" "Second one, too." "You sure you weren't dizzy when you set these?" He gave her a look that made her cheeks warm, but she held his gaze. "You always this particular about other folks' fences?" he asked. "I lived on land we didn't own for 2 years. I know what it looks like when something ain't sound." He nodded, the teasing gone from his expression. "I'll keep that in mind." They stood there a moment, neither speaking. The wind moved through the grass in long waves, and a hawk wheeled high overhead. "You ever think about going back east?" he asked finally. "I did. But there's no one left there. My parents died in the fever. My sisters married off before I turned 16. I made my life here, what there was of it." He watched her carefully. "You think you'd want to make a different one now?" Faye didn't answer right away. The idea rooted somewhere deep and quiet inside her. She looked out toward the pasture, where the tall grass rippled like water. "I'm not afraid of the work. I just never thought I'd get to choose anything." Isaac rested his hand along the top rail. "You do now." She didn't look at him, but her voice was steady. "I'd have to learn things. Mending tack, reading weather signs, keeping chickens without losing them to foxes." He smiled. "I can teach you what I know. You'll teach me what you know too." A soft cry from the cabin pulled her back, and she turned, already stepping toward the door. "He's waking." "I'll finish the west side," Isaac said. You go on." Inside, the baby wriggled in his basket, fists waving. She lifted him gently, cradling him against her shoulder. His hair had darkened in the last week, and his eyes, still blue, watched her with newborn wonder. "You're safe now," she whispered, kissing his brow. Later that evening, Isaac brought in a wooden box he'd built from spare planks. "For him," he said, setting it beside the hearth. "Figured he'd outgrow that basket soon." Faye crouched beside it, running her fingers along the smoothed edges. "You made this today?" Had some time between posts. She lifted Gideon into it, laying him on the folded quilt she'd sewn from scraps. The baby sighed in his sleep. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know." She looked up at him, something soft and unsure in her eyes. "Most men wouldn't." He met her gaze, voice quiet. "I'm not most men." "No," she said. "You're not." They shared supper by the fire, stew she'd seasoned with wild onion and a heel of bread that had gone crisp in the pan. She ate slowly, watching the flames cast shadows across the cabin walls. "I had a good mare once," she said, breaking the silence. "Before I married, fast and clever. She used to nudge me when I was near the fence like she didn't want me to leave. What happened to her? She was traded off without my say." Isaac leaned back, resting his arm on the bench. "You name her Juniper. That's a good name. I think about her sometimes, how she knew before I did that I was being walked into something I couldn't walk back out of." Isaac didn't ask more, didn't press. He simply nodded, and the silence between them stretched easy, like a blanket pulled warm across both their shoulders. When Faye stood to clear the bowls, he reached out and took one from her hand. "I'll wash." She hesitated, then let him. As he scrubbed the pot outside beneath the pump, she stepped into the doorway, arms crossed lightly. "You ever think about a family of your own?" "I did," he said without looking up. "But things kept getting in the way. Dust storms, bad crops, folks leaving. Never seemed like the right time. And now," he looked over his shoulder, his face unreadable in the fading light, "now don't seem so bad." The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of prairie sage and the promise of a dry morning. Faye stood there a long while after he went back in, watching the dark settle over the land. Something had shifted. Not fast, not loud, but steady, like a river changing course. Faye stepped into the furrowed rows of the garden plot just after sunrise, her skirt pinned at the sides to keep it from dragging in the soil. The earth smelled rich from the week's rain, and her boots sank slightly as she moved between the rows of early bean shoots. She knelt and began thinning them, her fingers practiced now. Isaac had shown her once how to check for crowding, how to leave the strongest. She didn't need reminding. Behind her, Gideon dozed in the sling across her chest, his small mouth parted, breath warm against her collarbone. His weight felt like something anchoring her, not holding her down but keeping her steady. She hummed under her breath as she worked, a rough tune she couldn't remember the words to anymore, just the shape of it. Isaac's footsteps approached from the barn, slower than usual. She didn't look up until he crouched beside the row, wiping his hands on a square of burlap. "Found a bad break in the roofline," he said. "Storm must have pushed the eaves loose." She brushed a curl off her cheek. "You going to patch it today, after I ride out to the creek?" "I want to check the water line before we take the cattle down tomorrow." She nodded, moving to the next plant. "You want me to make up some bread before you go? You don't have to." "I didn't ask if I had to." He gave a quiet laugh, drawing a line in the dirt with a stick. "I'd be grateful for it then." She glanced over at him. "What's beyond the creek?" He looked toward the line of cottonwoods in the distance. "After the bend, you hit the old wagon trail. Some folks still pass through, heading west." She shifted Gideon in the sling slightly. "You ever think of leaving, going further?" "I did once," he said. "Back when I still believed the next place would be better than the last. Now I figure better's something you build, not something you chase." She didn't speak, but the words settled between them like something planted. Later, while the loaf cooled on the sill, she stood at the stove boiling cloth diapers in the iron kettle. Gideon stirred in his cradle, fussing just enough to let her know he was ready. She dried her hands and lifted him, settling into the rocker to nurse. The cabin was quiet except for the ticking of Isaac's wall clock and the soft creak of the chair beneath her. Her thoughts drifted, not to the past, but forward, to autumn, to what might grow from the garden if the frost held off, to a second quilt, to longer days with more light. When Isaac returned late afternoon, sunburnt and dusty, she was mending a tear in her only good petticoat. He stepped inside and set the bucket from the creek near the hearth. "Water's still running strong," he said. "That trail's near washed out, though. Wagons won't be crossing easy." She looked up from her stitching. "You see anyone?" He hesitated, then sat on the bench near the door. "A man riding a roan gelding. Didn't come near, but he watched me a while before heading north." She rose slowly, setting the needlework aside. "Did he look like—" "No," Isaac said, firm. "He wasn't him. Too old, too lean. Didn't look like he was hunting anyone." She exhaled, rubbing Gideon's back where he lay in his cradle now. "Still, I don't like that. I'll double-check the locks tonight. And I'll sleep nearer the door." She met his eyes. "You don't have to do that. I know." They didn't speak for a long while after that, just the sounds of evening creeping in the soft nickering of the mare in the stall, the call of a night bird from the near woods. Isaac rose and lit the lamp, the warm glow softening the edges of the room. "You ever think about marrying again?" she asked, voice low. He didn't look surprised, just thoughtful. "I figured if I did, it'd be for more than just security. I'd want something real. Something that sticks." She nodded slowly. "Me too." He moved closer, not quickly, just enough to close the space between them. "Faye," he said, careful, not reaching yet. "I don't want to say something you're not ready to hear." "I hear you," she said. "I've heard you from the start." He reached then, gently, letting his hand rest over hers. The touch was warm, not uncertain. She didn't pull away. "I never thought I'd be wanted like this," she said, voice catching. "Not for who I am now." His thumb traced the edge of her palm. "You're exactly the woman I'd choose." She leaned into him then, her forehead brushing his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her back slowly, as though every inch had to be earned. And it had. Every moment, every hard-won breath since the day he found her in that broken grain bin. Outside, the wind had quieted. The stars began to prick through the dark like pinholes in a blanket. "Inside," she whispered. "Then let's make something that holds." The early July sun hung low and orange behind the cottonwoods as Faye pulled the last line of stitching through the linen hem. She sat on the porch rail, Gideon cradled against her hip in a sling she'd sewn from Isaac's old work shirt. The baby had grown heavier in the past week, his gaze tracking movement now, his fingers curling instinctively around the laces at her neckline. Isaac approached from the west field, shirt rolled to his elbows, a coil of rope slung across one shoulder. His gait had a slow ease to it, the kind a man wore when he trusted his land and the day behind him. He stopped at the edge of the porch and rested a hand on one of the beams. "You've been quiet this afternoon," he said. "I was thinking about the cellar," she replied, tying off her thread. "It's not deep enough to keep the jars from spoiling once the heat holds through August." He nodded. "I can dig it down another foot before the next planting. We'll need to brace the walls after that, else it'll cave when it rains. I'll cut more cedar from the north ridge. The roots there run shallow, won't be missed." She looked at him, eyes narrowed slightly. "You already planned it, didn't you? Started thinking on it after I saw you boiling those peaches." She glanced down at Gideon. "I'd like him to grow up with pears, Apples if we can keep a tree alive long enough. Isaac leaned against the post. I've got a friend in Seward. He owes me for a wagon tongue I mended last fall. He might have a sapling or two come September. Would you ride that far? If it's for your orchard, I would. She shifted Gideon higher on her hip, then stepped down to the grass. You think we'll still be here next spring? I don't see why not. She watched him for a moment, then said, I used to think I wouldn't stay anywhere more than a season. It's strange, wanting the same view year after year. He studied her face, the way the light slipped over her cheekbones. It's not strange, just means you want roots. She touched the sling, smoothing the fabric. I never had a say before. You have one now. They walked the edge of the pasture together, Gideon's soft breathing the only sound between their words. The cattle had been moved to the lower field that morning, and the grass here stood tall and undisturbed. A pair of meadowlarks lifted from the fence post as they passed. Faye gestured to a patch of open ground near the barn. That'd be a good spot for a shed, somewhere to store the preserves. And maybe a second cradle when the time comes. Isaac stopped walking. She turned to face him fully, eyes clear. I've been thinking about that too. What else have you been thinking about? His voice was low, not uncertain but careful. That I don't want to wake up anywhere else. That I want to teach Gideon how to read beside our stove. That I want my hands to smell like flour and wood smoke and your shirt when I fold the wash. He stepped closer, the grass brushing his boots. You want to marry me, Faye? I do. He reached for her then, not rushed, just sure. His hand settled at her waist, warm and steady. I was going to ask come harvest, he said. You're late, she said softly. He kissed her then, his mouth brushing hers like a promise, not a question. Gideon stirred faintly between them, and Isaac's hand shifted to cradle the baby's back. They stood there as the light thinned behind the hills, the land around them quiet and full. Faye leaned into him, her head resting beneath his jaw. You think we'll be good at this? She asked. I think we already are. She smiled against his chest. Then tomorrow we'll talk to the preacher. And I'll dig that cellar deeper. And I'll finish the hem on your wedding shirt. They stood a while longer until the first cricket chirped in the grass and the stars began to show. When they turned back toward the house, their steps matched without trying. The porch light glowed soft in the distance, and the night stretched wide and waiting around them. The preacher married them under the cottonwood tree just west of the pasture, where the ground sloped gently and the wind moved slow between the branches. Faye wore her best calico with a sprig of wild yarrow pinned at the collar. Isaac had shaved that morning, his jaw clean and sun-browned, a white shirt buttoned all the way, cuffs still damp from where he'd scrubbed them in the wash basin. Gideon slept through it all, bundled in a quilt across a straw-stuffed cradle Isaac had built the evening before, tucked beneath the preacher's wife's watchful eye. Afterward, they shared a simple meal under the open sky, a roast chicken, bread Faye had baked before dawn, and a jar of green beans from the neighbor's cellar, given as a wedding gift. The preacher and his wife didn't linger, riding off before dusk, leaving the new family with the hush of twilight and the smell of warm earth. That night, with the baby tucked safe in his cradle, Isaac unlaced his boots while Faye folded their quilt down at the foot of the bed. "You nervous?" he asked, voice low in the dark. "No," she said, sitting beside him. "I feel like I've been walking toward this for a long time, like I finally reached the door." He took her hand, running his thumb along the edge of her palm. "I've never wanted anything steady before. But with you, I can't think of anything else." She drew in a breath, resting her head on his shoulder. "It don't scare me anymore being seen. You look at me like I'm whole. You are." They lay down side by side, fingers laced, the soft sound of Gideon's breathing keeping rhythm with the wind outside. Faye pressed her face into Isaac's chest, and for the first time in her life, sleep came easy. In the weeks that followed, they fell into a rhythm that felt less like routine and more like belonging. Isaac returned from the ridge one morning with a pair of saplings wrapped in damp burlap, their roots tied with twine. Faye planted them near the garden, one for pears, one for apples. She sang low under her breath as she packed the soil, her hands dark with earth. "Won't fruit for years," Isaac said, handing her the watering can. "I'm not in a hurry," she replied. They took turns with Gideon. Isaac would carry him in the sling when Faye needed both hands for canning or scrubbing out the basin. Sometimes at dusk, he'd walk slow around the house with the baby tucked against his chest, whispering stories into the soft crown of his son's head tales about wild horses and rivers that ran clear enough to drink from. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Isaac returned from the barn with a small cedar box. He set it on the table and opened it without a word. Inside lay a folded scrap of paper, a worn ribbon, and a silver brooch shaped like a swallow. Faye reached for it carefully, brushing her thumb over the curve of the wing. "This belonged to your mother," she said, remembering the story he'd once shared. "She wore it every Sunday," Isaac said. "I thought you might want it now." Faye fastened it to her collar. "It feels right," she said, voice catching. "Like she passed something down. She did. You've got her quiet strength. I see it every day." That night they danced barefoot in the kitchen, the floor still warm from the fire. Isaac hummed a tune from Tennessee, one his father used to whistle, and Faye rested her head beneath his chin. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The wind brushed through the open window, carrying the scent of cut hay. The seasons turned. By autumn, the root cellar stood braced and dry beneath the slope behind the barn. Faye's shelves held rows of jars, their colors rich and bright: plums, pickles, tomatoes, and apples from a neighbor's tree traded for a day's help mending a fence. Isaac built a chicken coop from salvaged boards, and they welcomed 5 hens and a rooster, paid for with a bolt of muslin Faye had bartered at the general store. One morning, Faye stood on the porch, her hand resting over the small swell beneath her apron. She watched Isaac lead Gideon by the hand toward the stable, the boy toddling across the yard with wide, careful steps. Isaac reached down and lifted him high, settling him on his shoulders. Faye smiled, her fingers tightening slightly over her stomach. "He'll have a brother or sister by spring," she called out. Isaac turned, Gideon's hands tangled in his hair. "Yeah?" he asked. She nodded. He walked back toward her, slow and sure. "You all right?" "I feel strong," she said. He kissed her forehead. "You've always been." That winter, they read by lamplight in the evenings, Faye teaching herself from the primer Isaac had kept since boyhood. He traced her letters with a calloused finger, patient, proud. Gideon played quietly on the rug, his favorite toy a carved wooden horse Isaac had whittled from scrap. Snow came in February, thick and dry. Isaac shoveled a path to the barn each morning, then brought in wood for the stove. Faye baked cornbread and stitched a second quilt, this one smaller, softer, ready for the child growing inside her. When spring bloomed again, the orchard trees budded, fragile and pale. Gideon took his first steps on his own, arms outstretched, mouth open with laughter. Faye clapped, crouched low in the grass, her hair loose down her back. Isaac stood behind her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Their home stood strong, walls mended, roof braced, cellar full. The land around them green toward summer, and the days stretched longer, easier. They made love in the quiet hours after dusk, slow and familiar, the kind of closeness that needed no words. On a warm evening in early June, Faye stood barefoot in the kitchen, her second child cradled in her arms. Isaac set a bucket of water near the stove and leaned in to kiss her temple. "What'll we call her?" he asked, brushing the baby's cheek with one knuckle. Faye looked down at the tiny face. "Juniper," she said. "For what I lost, and what I found," he smiled. "She'll be strong. She'll be ours." And so they stayed through storms and seasons, through hard days and long nights with love that rooted deeper than any tree, and a life built from steady hands, quiet faith, and the kind of joy that didn't need to be spoken to be felt. The sun rose each morning over their land, casting golden light across the porch, the orchard, the fields. And inside, their home was full of laughter, warmth, and the lasting peace of two hearts that had chosen each other, and never once turned away.